Webflow can be a bear to learn, and now that I can look back at my first Webflow page, there were so many mistakes that I made that I've since learned from by taking several Webflow University courses, taking the Flux Academy Webflow Masterclass, and ultimately just putting in the reps of using the software time and time again. Now, I'm not a pro by any means, but I imagine that if you are a beginner getting started with Webflow, I would imagine that you're probably going to be making a lot of these same mistakes that I did. And so I want to show you the 5 biggest mistakes that I made when using Webflow, because if you are aware of these mistakes, then you're going to be able to learn this software a lot faster than if you just went in blind. So let's dive into it and go over the 5 biggest Webflow mistakes that I made. All right, so before we even get on to the 5 main mistakes, the prerequisite mistake that I made was thinking that Webflow was going to work like Figma, and that could not be further from the truth, because Webflow is a visual development software, whereas Figma is a design software. So Figma is used to create mockups of websites and product interfaces. And so the whole goal with Figma is being able to quickly iterate on designs, move things around so that you can get a sense on how you can have different iterations of a given web page or screen. Whereas Webflow, once you put something on here, it is coded in HTML and CSS. So I can't like drag this around because it's just going to like break the code. So that's the main difference there. So Figma is a design software, whereas Webflow is a visual development software. Okay, so the first biggest mistake that I made when using Webflow is not knowing how classes worked. So I was used to using Figma prior to using Webflow, and so there are no classes in Figma. And so this was a brand new concept to me. And so the best way that I can describe what a class is it's a way to both label and stylize an element on your web page. So for example, if we have this here, so this is a class, or this is a text block with a class of heading detail. So anything that's listed here, any of these labels are really classes of whatever element that is. And you add a class by typing in something in this block here, and then that makes it a class. But what does that mean? So I have this text block here called heading detail. And so what this does is it not only gives this group of text the label of heading detail, but it also gives it associated styles. So if we scroll down on the right here, anything that's in this, I think blue color is what that is. This is going to be what this class controls. So anything that has this heading detail class is going to have a bold weight. It's going to have a size of 14, height of 24, this particular color, this letter spacing. And so that's what makes this really powerful, because I can recycle this. And so if, let's say if I add a text block here, and let's say I want this text block to have this same styling. Well, instead of having to do that from scratch, I can just go over to here and I can just put in heading detail and I can click on that, and it's going to now give me that exact same styling. So classes are a way to basically reuse styles so that you don't have to always do everything from scratch. This doesn't just pertain to text, but also to div blocks. So div blocks are basically like frames. So it's a way to group different elements. And so for here, I have this div block called a button wrap. And so what that button wrap does is it is a way to group these buttons together. So I have flex. So basically, if I have something called button wrap as a class, it's going to be a flexbox design, which is basically the same thing as auto layout in Figma. It's going to be horizontal. Everything in that is going to be centered and aligned to the right. And you can see that it looks like that in this div block here. So if I have if I add something else, another div block, and I label it as button wrap, it's going to have these exact same attributes. And so the main thing with working with classes is you want to label them in a functional way. So the name of your class should indicate what it is. So everything that I have labeled here is very telling of what it is. So this whole section here is the hero grid content column. All right, so that's a pretty clear indicator of what this is. There's clearly a grid here, and this is the content column of the hero grid, whereas this is the lightbox column. And so you could basically just make these as functional as possible so that when you're looking at this or if someone else is looking at this, they'll be able to easily tell where everything is. Because if I just had all of these as div block 1, div block 2, container 1, container 2, it would be a mess. So just making sure to label things appropriately, and any class that you have, just making sure to have it functionally labeled so that you know exactly what it is. So that was the first biggest mistake that I made that I have since learned from, is learning what classes are and how to use them effectively. All right, the second mistake I made with using Webflow is not knowing how inherited changes work when it comes to responsiveness. So what I mean by that is with Webflow, if you're not used to it, you have views up here of desktop, tablet, mobile landscape, and mobile portrait. And so ideally, all of the content that you have on your web page should be responsive for each of those screen size. And so the main thing to know with this is that any change that I make on a larger screen size, or breakpoint rather, is going to cascade down and affect the breakpoints below it, okay? So for example, let's say I want to change this color to red for whatever reason, okay? So if I make that change here, then that is going to cascade down all the way down to mobile portrait, all right? So, however, let's say on mobile landscape, for whatever reason, when someone is on their mobile device in landscape, I actually want this to be pink, all right? So if I change that to pink, then what happens is mobile landscape or mobile portrait is also going to be pink. But if we go up to tablet, it's still going to be red. And so the main thing to know is that any change that you make over here in the styles is going to affect breakpoints lower than what you're working on, but it's not going to affect breakpoints higher. So again, if I change this again to some other color, yellow, or lime green, whatever that is, again, that's going to change what happens at a lower breakpoint, but it's not going to affect anything that happens higher. And so that applies to both with text, well, really any element, all right? So I could change any of these button styles, and depending on what breakpoint I change them, they're only going to affect at breakpoints lower than what I'm happen to be working on. And so that's the main thing to know with that. So any change that you make at a breakpoint is also going to affect things at a lower breakpoint. However, the content will change everywhere. So for example, anything HTML related, so anything that you see kind of like on this side, if I change any of this actual organization, it's going to affect not only the downstream, but it's going to affect the upstream. So let's say, for instance, actually, I'm going to undo all this so I don't have all this nastiness here. There we go. Okay, so let's say that I want to, for whatever reason, move this heading above this heading detail here. Well, if I do that, and I move this, let's say here, okay, that is going to affect everything, all right, both downstream and upstream. So any content that you change is going to affect, and I can do that like in the middle. Let's say I do something on tablet, and let's say I change the position of these buttons here. Well, that's going to affect absolutely everything. So it's going to affect every other breakpoint. So the main thing to know is that anything that you change that is position related or content related is going to affect every breakpoint no matter what, upstream or downstream. But anything that you change on this right side here, which is basically a CSS style, is only going to affect the breakpoint you're working on and anything below. It's not going to affect anything above that breakpoint. And so that's the main thing to know with that. The third mistake I made is not knowing how relative and absolute units work when it comes to sizing. I'm still not a pro when it comes to this, but the basic idea is that anything that you want to have static sizing, so meaning it's not going to change regardless of the size of the container it's in or the width of the screen, anything that you want to be static is going to be made in absolute units. So like, for example, we have this paragraph here, and so that has a size of 16 pixels. And so pixel is an absolute unit. So it does not matter the size of the container that it's sitting in. It does not matter what the width of this web page is. It is always going to be 16 pixels. And so if an image is 300 pixels, same thing. It is going to always be 300 pixels regardless of the width of the screen. Versus this image here uses relative units. So if you look at this project image here, you can see that it has a width of 100% and a height of 100%. What that means is that the container that this project image is sitting in, so the project thumbnail here, the project image is only ever going to take up 100% of the width and 100% of the height. It is never going to expand beyond that. So what that means is that if we narrow up this screen here, you can see how the width gets smaller. So as the screen width gets smaller and that parent container gets smaller, that image is going to shrink up so that it doesn't overflow. Okay. And so that's the main thing there. So anything that you want to have sort of dynamically change with screen size or container size, you want to use something that has a relative unit. And then anything that you want to have static, then you want to have absolute position units. So for example, another thing would be the border radius of this content badge here. So this is set for 15 pixels. So 50 pixels. So it will always be 50 pixels. It does not matter what changes occur on this web page, what width it is, what container it's in. It will always have a border radius of 50 pixels. And so I don't know if this really made a lot of sense, but just knowing that if you want to have something stay the same, use something like pixels. If you want something to be relative, then you can use something like percent. And there's other units as well, like ems and rems, that are dynamic, but I'm a little less familiar with those, so I'm not even going to try to explain those at this point. The fourth mistake that I made is not styling text efficiently. So what I would do before is, if I wanted to add a heading, is I would add a heading, and then I would change all of the style of that heading. So let's say I want to make it like red, and I want to make it a little bit bigger. All right, and let's say I want that to be my H1 heading. So I'm like, okay, that hopefully is there to stay. Well, if I add another H1 heading, it's not going to keep that style, because by default, if you change a heading, it's going to add a class here. And so if I change this one and I put 72 and I make this, even if I make that red as well, now it's going to call itself heading 2. And so by default, anytime you change a style of text or really anything, it's going to add a class. So how do I change a heading once so that it affects every other heading? And so the way to do that is by clicking on the heading, and then you can change all headings. So this is how you would want to change every single H1 heading. And so you have that for all the different heading sizes. So this is H2. So if I wanted to change how this looks, I would go into H2 setting, all H2 headings. And let's say I wanted to make that red. Okay, if I make that red, and then if I add a heading and I change it to H2, it's now going to look like that. And so that's the main thing there, is knowing how to style headings as well as paragraphs efficiently. So with paragraphs, you want to style those on the body, because every paragraph should look the same unless you want a specific text block style differently. So on the body, you would go to the typography, and this is where you would set what your primary paragraph text looks like. So that's the main thing to know with that, is figuring out how to easily style your text so that it the styles are able to easily be recycled throughout your web page. The fifth mistake that I made is not optimizing my web page to run fast. So with Figma, this isn't a live web page, so it doesn't really matter. I could use some incredibly high resolution photo and it doesn't matter because this isn't going to be a live web page. I don't have to worry about compressing my image. But when it comes to Webflow, there's things that we want to do to try to increase or rather speed up the load time, and that entails a couple different things. So one, there's this sort of drip drop little icon here. And a lot of times there will be styles that you create, classes that you create that end up not being used. And so just cleaning that up and removing those is a great way to speed up the load times, as well as just probably the biggest thing is going to the images and making sure that those are a reasonable size. Because if you have a lot of high resolution images, then that's going to slow down the web page. And so an easy way to compress your images right within Webflow is to go to this Expand Assets panel, and let's say I select all of these PNG files here. What I can do is I can just hit compress, and what that will do is it'll turn these into something called a WebP, and it's basically just like a compressed image of this, so it'll save a lot of space there. So those are kind of the main things to know when it comes to optimizing your web page, as well as just making sure you don't have a bunch of needless images that you aren't actually using in your web page. Now, I'll be honest, a lot of these mistakes I learned from by taking courses, but really the bulk of what I'm able to learn from has just been the reps that I put in with using Webflow. So if you are a beginner with using Webflow, even if a lot of these mistakes that I talk about make sense to you, I don't think you'll really be able to apply it that well until you actually start designing on Webflow. And that's where it becomes really important to not only learn from courses, but to just get in there and try to do the thing. If you are a complete beginner, I would recommend going and doing some of the Webflow University courses. They're free. They are immensely well produced. I mean, like top tier stuff here. And they have some really good courses on how to build web pages from scratch. Webflow University was where I started. I took their 101 class, and then I took I think it's their freelancer's journey. I took that. And so I was able to get a lot of the basics with learning how to use Webflow. And then I felt like I wanted a deeper dive after doing those things. So I went and I enrolled in the Flux Academy Webflow Masterclass. So if you're someone that has already dabbled with Webflow, has maybe built out your first web page, maybe done a few of the Webflow University courses, but you do want sort of those more advanced deep dives, then I highly recommend the Flux Academy Webflow Masterclass, because they go through and talk about how to use Webflow to build out modern web pages with complex layouts, complex animations. And so I learned a lot from taking that course. If you're a true beginner, I probably would not start with the Flux Academy course because it can be very overwhelming if you're not used to Webflow at all. So if you're a beginner, I wouldn't worry about the Flux Academy course. I would just do the Webflow University courses and ultimately just put in reps with using the tool. And then later on, once you get some experience with using Webflow and want that deep dive, that's where I feel like maybe the Flux Academy Webflow Masterclass might be useful to you. But anyway, even if you don't do either of those courses, I hope that you can learn from these mistakes that I made. I think that as long as you are aware of these mistakes, you'll be able to catch them a lot earlier than I did. And so if you found these to be helpful, then it would mean a lot if you hit the subscribe button. And if you are interested in checking out that Flux Academy course, I actually did a review on it. It's a 3-parter, so if you want to check that out, you can look at this video here. And until next time, I will see you in the next video. Take care.